Okay, I'm going to present the first half of this, and Sabrina will present the second half. We discovered that we had very similar views on the topic of the COVID pandemic when we each independently wrote a paper together with our respective co-authors, essentially applying Kelly's diagnostic constructs to try to understand people's experiences of the pandemic. We are also currently collaborating on two multinational projects in which people's stories of their COVID experiences are being collected. And we'll provide a few quotes from these stories during the presentation. Our previous relevant work, in Sabrina's case, has involved numerous papers looking at the understanding of illness experiences from a PCP perspective. And I've done some work looking at the effect of the Ebola pandemic on the West African country of Sierra Leone, which is a country that I'd visited several times previously to work with survivors of a brutal civil war. Amongst those I interviewed were probably some of the most courageous people that I've ever met. These were people who volunteered to act as burial workers during the pandemic. And here they are on the right of the screen singing a rap song that they composed about their experiences. When I asked them to compare the Ebola pandemic with the Civil War, they said that Ebola is worse than the war because you can run from the guns, but you can't run from Ebola. You can't negotiate with the virus at all. But in the war, you can negotiate with the rebels or the government or whosoever. You can negotiate, you can meet, you can have an understanding, but virus cannot have that understanding. I think what they're describing here is an experience of Kellyan anxiety, not being able to predict one's world. And this is very much the experience of many people during the COVID pandemic, reflected in the overused phrase that we are living in unprecedented times. Times that we don't have the constructs to enable us to predict. Many questions concerning the coronavirus remain unanswered, including whether, if we do ever begin to understand it, will it then mutate into a different form, which again is unpredictable? One of our American participants described it as, I'm a person whose life revolves around planning, making plans, and following them. I rely on the comfort of the spaces and routines I've made for myself. During COVID, all of my plans have been destroyed. I'm unable to plan for the future because everything is so unpredictable, and it makes it very difficult for me to function. I don't know when I'll be able to return to my comfort spaces or when I will be able to begin planning for the future. This pandemic has thrown my plan for the next 2 years completely out the window. Another common emotion during the pandemic is threat. Kelly said that death is threatening to most people, but so is any experience that shakes people's foundations by fundamentally challenging their identity and their core structures. Again, this was described by several of our American participants. One person talks about contemplating their imminent death. Other people were threatened by the possible death of loved ones. And others talked about more fundamental threats to their whole view of the world, beginning to understand that life will never be the same again, feeling that there would be a complete breakdown of social cohesion. Kelly defined stress as the awareness of potential threat. And this was particularly evident in some of the responses from participants in New York. One of them said, "I live in Manhattan. During the worst week, there was an ambulance siren every 5 to 10 minutes, and I felt like I was living in a war zone. I guess I was." Another was sitting on their porch in their house in Brooklyn on a beautiful spring afternoon, feeling at peace, until a refrigerated truck, which I assume was full of corpses, drove past. Because it was so long, it took a long time to turn the corner on our residential block. So the stress of awareness of the threat of death. Other emotions experienced during the pandemic are guilt and shame, both involving dislodgement from one's core role. Guilt, the role that one has construed for oneself, or shame, dislodgement from others' view of one's core role. The core roles that people have been dislodged from during the pandemic have included the roles of helper, breadwinner, caring family member, humane person, and unselfish member of the community, amongst others. And again, some descriptions from our American participants. There's a helplessness at not being able to go out to the front line because of prioritizing my family. I've always helped, and I'm not used to this feeling of helplessness. Not being there for my mum and sister. When I began working with COVID patients, I moved out of our shared apartment. Being completely alone for weeks has had a very negative impact on my partner's mental health, and I felt incredibly guilty putting him through this in order to satisfy my own need to help. Someone else describes how someone got too close to them. I reacted by arguing and even coughed towards them to illustrate my point and get them to back away. I felt shame afterwards that I reacted not with compassion and solidarity, but such fear and anger. And someone else felt extreme guilt that I, a well-educated white woman in her 40s, was able to get tested. I've never been more aware of my privilege. Kelly regarded constriction, the drawing in of the outer boundaries of one's world, as a strategy that can be used to deal with invalidation and, as he put it, incompatibility of construct systems. And I think we can regard social distancing measures and lockdown as essentially representing an enforced constriction. And while measures such as this have left many people feeling isolated, deprived, or trapped, for other people they've been a welcome relief. For some people they've even normalized lives that were already reclusive. And for some people they've allowed what Faye Francella called if-only fantasies. If only the season had been completed, my sports team would have won the championship. Again, some descriptions from American participants. One of them talks about realizing I have had no human contact for 2 months and feeling so alone without any end. Another talks about being stuck in the house I was abused in for the first 19 years of my life. Please do share this with others, if you like. People trapped in places attached to those kind of memories should know they're not alone. But for another participant, the experience was a more positive one. My lowest point emotionally was right before the shelter in place, when I felt so much uncertainty. The uncertainty and confusion about whether to cancel things and not knowing what choices to make caused the greatest anxiety and fear. The shelter in place provided clarity, rules, and a new routine, and was in some ways a relief. Another way of dealing with or avoiding invalidation is hostility, in Kelly's sense of extorting evidence for the validity of one's constructions. As John Raskin has described, one manifestation of hostility is the creation and dissemination of false facts. And these have been very evident during the corona epidemic. For example, China developed the virus in its laboratories. It's been spread through 5G masts. There are potential benefits of such dangerous practices as injecting or ingesting disinfectant, irradiating oneself with UV light, or taking anti-malarial medication. Hostility always has its perils, as has been discovered by some world leaders who've attempted to extort evidence for at least their own invulnerability by refusing to take protective measures, even when in contact with people who've been infected by the virus. And their hostility has led to themselves being infected, but more tragically, has led to devastating effects on the citizens of their countries, in particular Brazil. In case you don't recognize these two world leaders, Johnson of the UK at the top, Bolsonaro of Brazil at the bottom. Kelly's writings were often very prescient, and I think possibly no more so than his description of how a combination of constriction and hostility in a political leader may make him a community or even a national problem. He may try to gag those who disagree with him. He may become able to see or express only the most limited and therefore often misleading portions of the truth. He may refuse to allow anything to be seen in perspective. This may remind you of someone, but just in case it doesn't, a few clues from our American participants. One of them describes their worst experience as the helplessness of watching the Trump administration brainwash their followers and place the lives of people in danger through both their deliberate actions and inactions. Another talks about hearing what is not being done by our deranged sociopath US president. When he does something, It's the worst, most heinous idea ever. And someone else talked about the most frustrating part being knowing that people's lives are at stake and key decisions are being made by an orange buffoon. Okay, at this point, I'm going to pass over to Sabrina.
Thank you, David. I start sharing the screen. Can you see my slide? Okay. So what David has presented are all ways of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And these ways may be good in lessening the effects of the invalidation or to deal with threat and anxiety David has mentioned. But they can be considered a way to go back to the previous state rather than to face change. As examples of attempts to return to a normality, we can also consider the protests that we are seeing all over the world at the claim of the virus does not exist, so the negationist position. Or we can also consider the quotation by one of our participants, an Italian one. I'd like to be able to do everything like it was done before. So the attempt to cancel what has happened, like if it was possible to go back to the previous state. Whereas evidence shows us that the world is changing and someone believes that it cannot be as it was before. Nothing will be as it was before. Because, as some of our participants say, viruses affect everyone without distinctions and without caring about borders. Nothing should be taken for granted and everything can change in an instant. Thereby, in order to deal with the change, it may be more useful to try to have an active elaboration of our own perceptive field as Kelly defined aggression. We can consider as examples of this aggression the meme we find on the web with pictures or videos showing people who try to reconstruct everyday reality. For instance, this father who is doing a host-posh dinner party for kids within the house, or these people trying to have an interaction and communicate from one balcony to another, so to keep a relationship in the new world where the distance must be maintained. Some quotations that we think will represent this position are these ones: to appreciate, rediscover, re-examine the small things, and to boost creativity. This is a good expression of aggression, we think. I realized how much my time was unbalanced through work, despite it being the aspect of my life that brings me less gratification. So a way to reconsider our priorities and to understand that maybe the current society is too fast-paced and demanding, and sometimes we need to slow down. We can then consider the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity of change. And these quotations of participants that recall us the possibility of considering what is happening as an opportunity for new discoveries and a new journey are well represented. For instance, by this quotation, we are not absolute lives, sorry, I cannot see the quotation. we are not absolute rulers of our lives and of nature. We need social regulation, humanity, and respect for humans and nature. This new construction of COVID as an opportunity of change also lead our attention to the importance of cooperation and solidarity. From this experience, I learned to look around me with more careful eyes, to look at others' fragilities with more consideration, and to open myself to listening and helping others. And finally, this construction brings to the fore the basic intersubjectivity of human being. Relationship with others is what really matters. But which kind of relationship? We are used now to mainly having online relationship, so to meet each other through a monitor. But the problem here is how can the relationship be when we are online? To understand this, I want to refer to one of the experiences I had during this period with one of my patients, who, while I was taking note of what she was saying, thought that I was doing something else and asked me what I was doing. This allowed us to explore what were her anticipations, and to understand that her anticipation was that the other person was not there with her while being online, but was rather thinking to something else, being somewhere else then, even if in front of her. We then construed the difference between this way of being in front of a monitor and connected with another way of being with the other person, living the present moment, the same moment, in an authentic relationship. This is what presence means. This is crucial also to reconsider what health is. Health is in effect usually considered as the absence of illness, a state of complete well-being, as an old definition of the World Health Organization suggests. So a state I can be proud of, so full of pride. On the contrary, a new concept of health, which is proposed by Gadamer, is to consider health as a condition of being there, of being in the world, of being together with people, of being taken in by an active and rewarding engagement with the things that matter in life. This different concept of health also leads to a different concept of care. We are used to the metaphor of war to represent care during these days. So considering COVID as an enemy to defeat and physicians as heroes who are doing this fight, and ill persons as victims. Physicians themselves are tired of this kind of role that always sees them as never enough, never able to satisfy this role. So that leads them to compare with guilt. One of the physicians, more of them, rather claim for humanity. So a role that is characterized by humility, openness, and co-responsibility. Let's try to consider the experience we have with the COVID-19 pandemics in terms of the experience cycle by Kelly. So the different phases of anticipation, investment, encounter, confirmation or disconfirmation, and revision. I'm illustrating this through an example, again, of one of my patients who usually moved into the world, departing from the anticipation that she had to be good, appreciated by the others. This was her main interest, what led her actions. Departing from this premise, especially in front of the current situation, where she was afraid she couldn't deal with the situation by keeping control, which was her usual way, she rather preferred to retire from social relationship, departing from a pessimistic, as she defines her anticipation, that she will not succeed to be good enough, and the others will not understand, will not respect also her fear of being infected. This way, what happened in the encounter phase was that instead of feeling appreciated, she rather felt bad and not appreciated. Thereby, her anticipation that through control she could be appreciated was disconfirmed. Thereby, we tried different experiments in line with the anticipation that she could live fully what was important to her. So what led her was her curiosity and experimentation. So we would say a transition of aggression to deal with the situation. And this led her to do some experiences with others, still being careful. So adopting of all the preventive measures that are suggested and that help her to feel reassured, but still trying to open to the world. And finally, she had an experience of having fun and being present again in the relationship. This is a different way of dealing with the current situation, and maybe also to do different experiments also with the situation we are going to face in the next future, when we will be more and more involved in new experiments. Each of you can practice this by trying to understand his or her own experience, telling the other person, and trying to reconstruct this experience in terms of the experience cycle by Kelly. I think we can stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Also, we get terrible feedback if you don't. David and Sabrina, thank you so much for speaking to what essentially is a global lived experience at the moment. There's clearly never been anything quite like this, or in as much as this has the potential to be construed subjectively on a global scale. And it was interesting to listen to your examples, because they would have resonated with many of us. And particularly, I think Kelly's prescience and his description of the implications of hostility. I'd like to really kick this off by asking people if you would like to share with us some of your discussions about your own anticipations of the situation that we're in, and also perhaps to talk a little bit about your own constructions around conservation and change. So would somebody like to start off the conversation? Who had a particularly interesting conversation? It might have been hard to share some of your experiences, but is there something that anybody felt that perhaps would resonate with many people on this environment, on this discussion?
What struck me was the extent to which people's personal circumstances made a difference to their experience. I think it was Marta. It was, oh gosh, I've forgotten her name, the other lady, Sylvia, who mentioned that she was in close contact with a person who was having to cope with the virus personally, and that made a difference to the way in which she experienced it as a family issue almost. Just that thought, I guess. But your own circumstances, your family circumstances are going to make a big difference to how you encounter it. You know, I'm an oldie who spends most of his time in the house anyway, in the garden, and wanders around the block for a walk, and 10 miles on the bicycle now and again. But, you know, I'm not confronted with children to look after, with other people in distress. So my experience is different.
I think that's part of what we're going to find in a discussion like this, that everybody's experience is different. And I think we need to be careful that we don't weigh up our own experience as somehow not valid or not good enough to discuss. I think we need to be clear that we come into this with an understanding that whatever experience you've had and whoever you are, and whether you've had a reasonably, what somebody else might term a reasonably easy ride, or you've really struggled, everybody's experience is as valid as anybody else's. So please do not feel that you can't share your understanding or your thinking about COVID because other people will think badly of you or will dismiss your concerns, because we've all experienced this. I mean, personally, I find the whole fact that I'm living in what is essentially a science fiction story in my own lifetime, and I cannot turn to the end of the book to see how it turns out, or even stop reading. I find that personally quite terrifying. And my response has been definitely personally to move from a feeling of conservation and wanting to close down into a small area of my life and focus on that, to actually looking at the potential for change and changing my perspective and finding validity in the things that perhaps I dismissed personally as being not enough time to do this, for gardening being one of them. But it's that I think we need to be really clear that nobody will be judged. So on that basis, was there anybody who had anybody who found a similar experience to the person they were discussing with in the breakout room?
Yeah,
sorry, Ken. Okay.
Jump in just real quickly. Lauren and I think, are going to have to stay afterwards and share insurance information to bill each other for the therapy session we just had. But with very different experiences, we found a little bit of a commonality in some of our anticipation that was challenged by our experience, which was that there would be some kind of uniform teamwork, solidarity. We're all in this together, and that we'll come together around whatever circle it is we're dealing with. And I think we both found in very different ways that kind of extreme anticipation that just because we're in a extraordinary circumstance that we'll have perfect solidarity with either our social or our work circles was an unreasonable expectation. We had to kind of get more nuanced in how we thought about those relationships and how to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Did anybody experience that? The work that I've been doing with people, several people have mentioned that as feeling a sense of betrayal, that systems that they thought would support them and would jump in and would be developed and would be there just weren't. I mean, coming from the UK, I can tell you that we're having quite an exciting ride here. And people that I've spoken to have spoken of that as a sense of betrayal. Has anybody else had that experience or know of people who've had that experience? Guys, this is going to be a difficult plenary if you don't actually talk to me.
Well, I'll talk, but it maybe it's not exactly what you're talking about. So we had 3 people in our group, one of whom had come to Australia from Italy in February with this plan or anticipation of being able to see the country and having a really wonderful time. So we talked a lot about how many cycles of experience she actually went through during the 5 months that she was here. But she did mention maybe not betrayal, but a real sense of frustration and anger that this virus had come in and like ruined all her plans, because she was now, you know, in lockdown, so she wasn't allowed to go and visit all the places she wanted to visit. And just to another point that you made, the other person in our group said that the country where he was living, there'd been so many different things going wrong one after the other that he felt he was living in some kind of dystopian novel. So by the time COVID came around, it wasn't actually that big a deal to start off with. And it was only when, I guess, it sunk in that it was actually real, that then they had to learn how to reconstruct that, because it's like, oh no, this is actually happening. And like you said, we don't know the end of the novel. We don't know what's going to happen. But he didn't really talk about a sense of betrayal as such in that, I think, because it was more, you know, this can't be real. This many things going wrong one after the other. So I found it very interesting, because for me, I just stayed home. Basically, I left the house once a week. So I didn't do any experimenting with COVID. My husband went out and did it all for me and then sort of brought the world back in. So I guess I was just hiding in my own little cubby house. Yeah, so the 3 of us had very different experiences. So it was a really, really good discussion for us. So,
does anybody else in that group want to add anything to that? In your working lives, how many people have you been working on Zoom in your working lives? Have your working lives changed dramatically?
Yes, that was, I think, the main theme that we picked up in our subgroup, was about being challenged and the anxiety and the guilt, I think, because of being dislodged from roles as educators and therapists in one context, and then being required to move into a much more online context, which wasn't as, you know, familiar or confident. So there's a transition, I think, around that I think we all have found a way of reconstruing and adapting to the different challenges of working both with clients and students online. But I think it's still that process is still obviously ongoing, and it's quite hard. And I think certainly my anxiety levels have been quite high at times. Well, I used to be that kind of educator or therapist. Now can I be this kind? And what kind is it? But that's been a challenge, and certainly that cycle of experiences is still rotating.
One thing that struck me in our own group, which really relates to what you've been saying, Keith, is that all of us have had experience of a different world. We might feel betrayed, we might not. We might see the need to make some change. I'm wondering what this whole experience is doing to the 8-year-olds and the 9-year-olds who don't have our background to provide a context to what's happening and to see what the situation we're in at the moment as, well, in some kind of perspective. The other thought I might share with you in terms of perspectives is that my grandfather died of Spanish flu exactly 100 years ago, as did one of his children who would have been my uncle. And it so happens that my grandmother and my father, aged 4 at the time, survived. I mean, that gives me a certain kind of perspective. Perhaps each of us can tell a similar sort of story. But what about our kids, or rather, in my case, grandkids? Are they seeing it? What perspective do they?
Can I talk about my experience? Yeah, or maybe different than you. I mean, I think my experience with COVID-19 or the lockdown has brought me back to my experience of uncertainty during the war. I'm coming from Gaza Strip. And trying to understand the difference between my sense of my actual experience of uncertainty in war situation and my agency, the way I dealt with it, the level of resilience that I had, with the sense of uncertainty created by COVID-19 in Britain. I mean, before COVID-19, I was thinking in Britain, I would not live in a situation of uncertainty that I had before in war situation. I think this experience, this comparison between two experiences of uncertainty evokes my thought about what does uncertainty mean. And I believe now that uncertainty is an integral part of everyday life, regardless of different politics and different place and different culture. Or maybe it brings us back to the relationship between situation of uncertainty, vulnerability, and agency, or the concept of agency. Although I always believe that I'm a very agentive person, that I manage my life in war situation, and I managed to leave and brought my family here. And the situation that I'm living in now, being in a in a country that has a strong socioeconomic system, etc. But I feel like if I'm in a war situation, I would be more able to adapt and more able to find a solution for the day-to-day problem that I have.
That's very interesting.
Which is just what the people in Sierra Leone were saying.
In a sense, war is more, it's more circumscribed, isn't it? And it's clearer to make, it's easier to make sense of, in that you have an idea of what war is, whereas we don't really have an idea of what our society is going to look like or how we're going to function at the moment. There's no real historical precedent that we can draw on to make some sense of where we might be going, especially if we look at it in terms of against the things like global crisis as well, the global warming crisis. We seem to have problem within problem within problem. I know that a number of people, a number of youngsters that I've talked to, for them COVID is a passing event, because actually what they're focused on is the end of the world, literally. And in some ways they're really annoyed at the adults because we're not getting on with either of them now. We seem to be sitting waiting for something to happen. And that I've experienced a lot of anger with the young people that I work with, because they feel like, well, in one way they look at us and they say, well, you're the adults, why aren't you doing something about it? And the other ways they say, oh, so you're just like kids, you actually haven't any power either. And I'm having those conversations with young people at the moment.
Sandy, can I just wanted to say before we finish, about 5 minutes left, don't we, that
yes,
Sabrina and David have done such a wonderful job in assembling all those experiences and putting them in the framework of Kelly's diagnostic constructs. I just wanted to briefly bring it back to the theoretical level, but not to take it away from the experiential level. I mean, when I think about Kelly's definitions of emotions, say when helping somebody, it's usually one emotion, you know, aggression or hostility, or his various emotions that he and McCoy have listed. But what's so incredible here is that the topic has actually elicited every single one of those emotions in one fell swoop, which to my mind sort of validates the relevance and practicality of personal construct theory, but also makes me want to reflect back to what you've said, everybody, or those people who have talked about their own experiences, to what extent that theory is helpful and throwing light on the experience and helping you to understand it better, and even more important, to suggest some new ways of dealing with those problems or difficult emotions. Just wanted to say that.
Harry, could you say a bit more about what you're thinking?
Not really much more than that. It's more of a question I'm asking people, I think. But the main thing I'm thinking is that Sabrina and David have done written a very important paper and done a very important presentation there that should somehow be fed out wider than the community. I think the methodology of the theory has helped to actually systematize, or, you know, without getting pathological. That's the important thing about Kelly's dimensions, that you know, we all experience them at different times. I mean, I could talk about my family, but I think I'd rather turn it over to someone else.
Mike, I'm tempted to ask you, given that I know that you're in America, is there something that you'd like to add to that in terms of your present situation?
Sure. You know, I was really taken, Sandy, when you were talking about the kids saying, you adults aren't doing anything. Yeah, and you used the phrase that we're just sitting around. That's the sense that I get in the States, that that we're just sitting around. The sense of betrayal and anger, I think, or the sense of that war is preferable to this, seems to come, in my opinion, from our failure to see that A, this is a crisis, and B, it requires a systemic reorganization of ourselves. We seem at the collective level, at the leadership level, to just be waiting for something to happen, refusing to see that we've got to change the way we live. And that's my biggest disappointment, that somehow the opportunity that Sabrina talks about has not been actualized. We have not seen this as an opportunity. The only opportunity that I've seen discussed is in David's talk with the wonderful person, I think, who said, we have to live more in the present. It's getting me to see that I need to connect more to my neighbor, to my kid, to my spouse, or what have you. That's a positive that comes out of it. There are many other things that we could be doing, but we're failing at a collective level. That's my sense.
David, what would you say to that? How would you respond to that?
I have 2 minutes to respond. I mean, what I was going to ask people, people have talked about very negative experiences. I wondered if in people's pairs, anyone had come up with positive experiences. Certainly, at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm living in Cornwall at the moment, and the sea was a beautiful shade of turquoise that it's never been before. The sand was white. There were dolphins. I believe there've been fish in the canals in Venice. there have been a few silver linings in this cloud, I think. And going on from what Michael was saying, I wish we could work on those, maximize them. Perhaps some political leaders will lose their jobs as a result of this crisis, which again will be one positive outcome. But hopefully we can focus on the opportunities for change that Sabrina was talking about.
Sabrina, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I understand. I absolutely understand what Mike was saying, and I think that it depends a lot on the kind of experience as well. Anyone, as Sandy, you were saying, I absolutely agree with you. There are not right or wrong experiences, and they change according to what also you are living also in the context you are. I think that in some contexts, for instance, in Italy, you had the opportunity really to experience all of these kind of transitions. So for sure, you have a negationist position, you have hostility, but you have a lot, really a lot of situations where you can find an opportunity. Now, for sure, you have to keep in mind that the quotations we have presented are coming from different questions. So, of course, the American ones were more focusing on bad experiences, whereas the Italian ones we have chosen are more focused on positive experiences. But I find that, for instance, in Italy, you have many of those, especially during the lockdown. Maybe now we are in a more difficult situation because there is a transition, a new situation again, and a bigger difficulty to adapt to this. Mm-hmm. Probably other countries have been facing this situation for longer, as maybe governments haven't taken a strict position and a clear position. And then finally, I want to say that it depends a lot. I saw in our context, but almost everywhere, there is not a good way or a bad way to manage the situation. What is important that we are trying to do something. I think that anger comes from, and also what we were saying about young people, come from this attitude, this passive attitude, or simply constriction again. So I simply avoid doing anything. It doesn't matter what you do. But if you try to be, someone mentioned to be agent, if you try to be agent, I feel that. And so maybe you can more likely have this sense of opportunity. This is only what I want to do.
That sounds like a really important take-home message, really. That in the sense of treating everybody's experience in a credulous way and accepting that they're coming from a place of meaning. And just because we don't understand it, we do have the tools as a PCP community to extend our own understanding of other people's experiences. And perhaps this is a position where we can actually affect some change and some support by actually using our own tools and our knowledge to enable people to find a way of managing situations, because if we're open to their experience, it gives them a chance to start to explore it in a way that makes people feel like they have some control and some agentic power in the situation. Has anybody got anything else that they would want to add? Otherwise, I'm going to call it to a close purely on a time basis. Anybody?
Yes.
Yes, go on then.
When we went out clapping once a week for the NHS workers, my neighbours are a bit away from me, so I went out with a bell, and it gave me a chance to walk down to the end of the block for me and meet 3 new neighbours that I invited into my garden for a cup of tea, which otherwise I probably wouldn't have, even if I walked around the block. So that was quite positive.
Yes. Sharon, thank you very much. That's a lovely thing to end on. Thank you, everybody, for your participation and also for taking part in what may well have been very difficult discussions. Thank you for your openness and actually your bravery, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. And thank you for attending.
I again want to thank you. I want to thank Sabrina and David for this wonderful presentation. What I find most valuable about it is this type of research that they're doing. It makes me not just think, but it moves me. It moves me to be able to hear what people are saying and feeling about this type of a thing. And PCP, I hope, provides both some tools for understanding and for seizing some of the opportunities that I think Sabrina talked about. The next Constructivist meetup will be on October 1st. Peter Caputi will speak on, I will tell you, what would Hinkle make of the COVID pandemic? It's October 1st, same time. Please note the time. Also, please note that you can find all the information that we have on Constructivist meetups in our website. It's called constructivistmeetup.org. Constructivistmeetup.org. It will contain. It contains the program. When we have the videos, they're posted there. It is possible to have discussions about the various issues, and so we hope to see you there as well. Thank you so much for participating, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Enjoy. Be well. Thank you. Bye.